The wind howled through the empty canyons as John Carter tightened his grip on the rifle, watching the dust cloud approach. 10 Apache warriors rode toward his isolated ranch, not with weapons drawn, but with desperation in their eyes. For the first time in years, his solitude was about to shatter. John Carter hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in a month. His ranch, tucked between the red rocks of Arizona, was a place men came to forget, or be forgotten. The Apache knew him as the quiet white man who didn't bother their hunting grounds, and in return, they left him alone. Until that afternoon. The first rider raised his hand in peace. His name was Chaska, a face John recognized from distant encounters near the river. "We need shelter," Chaska said, his voice rough but calm. Behind him, a young woman clutched a child, her eyes darting toward the horizon. John didn't ask why. The unspoken rule of the desert was simple: you helped, or you died alone. He nodded toward the barn. As the Apaches settled, John noticed the way they listened, not to him, but to the wind. Something was coming. The barn creaked under the weight of the desert wind as John watched the Apache warriors move with quiet purpose. They didn't speak much, but their eyes kept drifting toward the northern ridge. Chaska knelt by the fire, feeding it small, controlled breaths of flame. The young woman, her name was Najoni, John learned, sat closest to the heat, her child wrapped tightly in a faded blue blanket. The boy couldn't have been more than 4, his wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings without a sound. John handed Chaska a canteen. The Apache drank slowly, then passed it to the others. No words were exchanged, but the gesture carried weight. Years of living alone had taught John that trust wasn't given in the West, it was earned in silence. Then Najoni spoke. "They follow us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't need to ask who. The way she said it told him everything. Trouble wasn't just coming, it was already close. Outside, the wind carried something new, the distant rhythm of hooves. Not the steady, scattered steps of wild mustangs, but the deliberate march of riders. Too many to count. John moved to the window, his fingers brushing the edge of his rifle before stopping himself. If this was a fight, it wasn't his. Not yet. Chaska stood, his face unreadable. "You have horses?" he asked. John nodded toward the small corral where his 2 mustangs stood. "Not enough for all of you." A flicker of frustration crossed Chaska's features, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to the others and spoke in low, rapid Apache. John caught only one word: Nakai, white man. He didn't know if it was a warning or a plea. Then, from the ridge, a gunshot split the air. It wasn't aimed at them, not yet. A warning. A claim. Someone out there wanted the Apaches to know they were surrounded. Najoni's grip tightened around her child. "They won't let us leave," she said. John exhaled, his mind racing. He had stayed out of the world's problems for years. But the desert had its own rules, and right now, it was asking him a question he couldn't ignore. The hoofbeats grew louder, the gunshot echoed across the canyon walls like a thunderclap, sending a flock of startled crows scattering into the twilight. John felt the tension in the barn tighten like a coiled rattlesnake. Chaska motioned sharply, and the Apaches moved with practiced silence, extinguishing the fire, gathering weapons, positioning themselves near the windows with arrows notched. Najoni pressed her child's face against her shoulder, her breathing steady but her knuckles white around the knife at her belt. John watched them all, realizing with a cold clarity that these people weren't just running from something, they were being hunted. And now, by sheltering them, he'd made himself a target too. The hoofbeats grew louder, close enough now to distinguish individual riders, maybe 8, 10 at most. Then a voice called out from the darkness beyond the ranch, speaking in broken Apache before switching to rough English. "Carter. We know you're in there." The accent was Texan, thick with arrogance. John's stomach dropped. He knew that voice. Sam Coulter. A man he'd crossed paths with years ago during the silver rush, a bounty hunter who'd sell his own mother for $1. Chaska's eyes locked onto John's, a silent question burning in them. John gave the slightest shake of his head. Don't react. Coulter was testing, probing. He didn't know for sure they were here. But then Nijoni's child whimpered, and the entire barn froze. Outside, the horses stirred. A long pause. Then Coulter's laugh, ugly and triumphant. Well now. Ain't this cozy? John made his decision fast. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and tossed his spare revolver to Chaska, who caught it without hesitation. There's a root cellar behind the corn sacks, John muttered. Hidden trapdoor. Get the woman and child down there. Chaska hesitated, then nodded. As Nijoni was ushered away, she turned back, her eyes wide with something that wasn't fear, it was guilt. They don't just want us, she whispered. They want what we took. Before John could demand answers, Coulter's voice rang out again. Send out the thieves, Carter. We ain't here for you. A lie. John knew Coulter's type. No witnesses, no loose ends. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the barn doors, rifle ready. Behind him, Chaska and 2 warriors melted into the shadows near the hayloft. Outside, the first rider emerged from the darkness, Coulter, his scarred face grinning beneath a battered Stetson, a shotgun resting across his saddle. 4 more men flanked him, their hands near their holsters. Moonlight glinted off badges. Not bounty hunters. Deputy marshals. John's blood ran cold. This wasn't a chase. This was an execution. And Nijoni's words echoed in his skull, they want what we took. The moon cast long shadows across the ranch yard as John stepped into the open, his rifle held low but ready. Coulter's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth beneath his unkempt mustache. The so-called deputies fanned out behind him, their hands resting too casually on their revolvers. John recognized the look in their eyes, men who'd crossed a line and knew there was no going back. You're trespassing, Coulter, John said, keeping his voice flat. Ain't no warrant out here. Coulter spat tobacco into the dust. Don't need one for thieves and murderers, Carter. Them Apaches killed a white family up near Cedar Fork. Stole something precious. His eyes flicked toward the barn. We aim to get it back. The lie was so bold it almost took John's breath away. He'd known Coulter was a snake, but this? Fabricating massacres to justify a hunt. Behind him, John heard the faint creak of the hayloft door, Chaska moving into position. Then one of the deputies spoke up, a young man with nervous eyes. Just hand him over, mister. We don't want trouble. John almost laughed. The kid was new. Probably didn't even know he was riding with criminals. But the other 3? Their fingers twitched near their guns, their faces hard. They knew exactly what this was. A sudden movement in the barn's shadows, Nijoni emerged, her child nowhere in sight. She walked straight past John, her chin high, and faced Coulter. You want this? She pulled a small leather pouch from her dress and tossed it at his feet. It landed with a heavy thud. Coulter's face lit up with greed as he dismounted to grab it. But when he opened it, his expression turned to rage. Where is it? He snarled. Nijoni smiled, cold as a winter creek. Gone. Burned. The secret dies with my people. Coulter backhanded her so hard she fell into the dust. John's rifle came up in an instant, but froze when he saw the deputies' guns drawn, all aimed at him. Time slowed. The truth crashed over him like a flash flood. This wasn't about revenge or justice. That pouch was supposed to hold something worth killing for. And Nijoni had just thrown away their only bargaining chip. Then, from the northern ridge, a new sound split the night, the high, keening cry of an Apache war whistle. Coulter's head snapped up. Oh hell, he muttered. Because the whistle wasn't coming from the barn. It was answering from the darkness beyond. The war whistle's echo hadn't faded when the night erupted in motion. From the darkness beyond the ranch, shadows detached themselves from the rocks, a dozen Apache warriors materializing like ghosts, their faces painted for war. Coulter's men wheeled their horses in panic, the young deputy's voice cracking as he shouted, "Ambush!" But it was too late. The first arrow took a deputy through the throat before his gun even cleared its holster. John hit the dirt as bullets tore through the air above him. He rolled behind a water trough, his mind racing. This wasn't a rescue, it was a trap Chaska had set, using John's ranch as bait. The realization burned like whiskey in a fresh wound. Najoni still lay where she'd fallen, her eyes locked on John with terrifying intensity. "Now you see," she mouthed over the gunfire. Coulter had scrambled behind his horse, firing wildly toward the barn where Chaska and the others now returned fire. The remaining deputies were shooting at anything that moved, Apache, rancher, it didn't matter. The young one took an arrow in the shoulder and screamed like a gutted rabbit. John could taste the copper tang of blood in the air, could smell the gunpowder and terror. Then came a sound that froze everyone, the high-pitched wail of Najoni's child from inside the barn. In that heartbeat of stillness, John saw the truth click together in Coulter's eyes. The bounty hunter lunged toward the barn, his shotgun blasting the lock apart. John was moving before he'd made the decision, tackling Coulter just as the man crossed the threshold. They crashed through the doorway in a tangle of limbs, Coulter's elbow catching John's temple hard enough to see stars. The child stood trembling by the hidden cellar door, his tiny fists clutching the blue blanket. Coulter's grin turned feral as he raised his gun. "Guess I'll take the cub instead," he spat. A gunshot cracked. Coulter staggered, looking down in disbelief at the red blossom spreading across his chest. Behind him stood the young deputy, his service revolver smoking, his face white as bone. I ain't no murderer," the kid stammered. From outside came sudden silence, then Chaska's voice calling in Apache. The remaining deputies threw down their guns. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. John crawled to the child, shielding him from the carnage. Through the shattered doorway, he saw Najoni rising slowly, her gaze sweeping over the dead and wounded. When her eyes met John's, there was no gratitude there, only grim satisfaction. Because this had never been about shelter, this had always been about justice. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air as John carried the trembling child back to Najoni. She took her son without a word, her eyes scanning the battlefield where Apache warriors moved between the fallen, checking the wounded. The young deputy sat slumped against the barn wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of shock. Chaska emerged from the shadows, his gaze locking onto John with an unsettling intensity. "You fought well," he said simply, as if commenting on the weather rather than a life-and-death struggle. John wiped blood from his brow, his hands shaking not from fear but from the dawning realization that he'd been a pawn in someone else's game. "You knew they'd come," he accused, his voice low and rough. "You used my home as bait." Chaska didn't deny it. Instead, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, its edges charred as if rescued from a fire. "This is why they hunted us," he said, handing it to John. The document was written in flowing Spanish, signed with an elaborate seal. John's rough translation sent a chill down his spine. It was a land grant, older than the Republic of Texas itself, giving rightful ownership of nearly 50,000 acres to the Apache people. Coulter and his backers had been trying to erase it from existence. "They murdered 3 of our elders for these papers," Chaska said quietly. "Najoni's husband died protecting them." Outside, the remaining deputies were being disarmed. The young one, the kid who'd shot Coulter, looked up at John with desperate eyes. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to God, I thought we were chasing outlaws." John believed him. The corruption went higher than any of them had imagined. Then Najoni spoke for the first time since the battle, her voice carrying across the yard like a cold wind. They will send more. She wasn't talking about the deputies. She meant the powerful men behind Coulter. The land barons and politicians who stood to lose fortunes if this document came to light. John stared at the paper in his hands, its weight far greater than its physical form. He'd spent years running from the world's problems, but this? This had followed him into the deepest solitude. The child in Nijoni's arms stared at him with ancient eyes, as if waiting for his decision. From the northern trail came the sound of approaching riders, too many to count. Chaska tensed, his hand going to his knife. But it wasn't more enemies. It was the rest of the Apache band. And they weren't alone. The approaching riders emerged from the dust like figures from a dream, 20 mounted Apache warriors flanking 3 weathered white men in faded army blues. John squinted against the rising sun, recognizing the insignia on the soldiers' uniforms even before their leader spoke. Captain Elias Buchanan, the gray-bearded officer announced, reining in his horse just feet from where John stood. 10th Cavalry. The Buffalo Soldiers. John had heard stories, black cavalrymen who rode harder and fought fiercer than any white regiment, though you'd never hear that east of the Mississippi. Buchanan's sharp eyes took in the scene, the bodies, the wounded deputy, the land grant still clutched in John's hand. "Seems we're late to the dance," he remarked dryly. Behind him, the other 2 soldiers kept their rifles ready, their gazes flicking between the Apaches and the surviving deputies. Chaska stepped forward, speaking rapid Apache to a warrior with eagle feathers in his hair, clearly a leader of the newcomers. After a tense exchange, Chaska turned back to John. They followed the trail from Cedar Fork. Found what remained of the white family Coulter claimed we murdered. Nijoni made a sound like a wounded animal, clutching her child tighter. The young deputy struggled to his feet, his face ashen. Then who killed them? Buchanan's smile held no humor. Same men who burned the evidence. Only they got sloppy, left one survivor. He gestured to his left, where a warrior guided forward a skinny teenager on a pink pony. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, his face bruised, his hands bound. "Meet Jimmy Coulter," Buchanan said. "Nephew to your late friend Sam." The pieces crashed together in John's mind. Coulter had murdered his own kin to frame the Apaches, just to cover the theft of their land. The sheer brutality of it stole his breath. But Buchanan wasn't finished. "Problem is, the boy here got loose during the attack. Saw everything. Including the men paying his uncle." He leaned forward in his saddle. "One of them wears a U.S. Marshal's star." A ripple went through the gathered Apaches. The young deputy swayed on his feet. John felt the weight of the land grant in his hand like a live coal. This went beyond corrupt sheriffs, this reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Nijoni stepped forward suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Then we take the fight to them." Her eyes burned with a light that made even the warriors tense. "Not just for our land. For all of it." She looked at John, then at Buchanan. "You know where they gather. The canyon where 3 rivers meet." Buchanan's eyebrows rose. "Fort Mercer. That's a fool's errand. Place is a fortress." But John was already moving toward his horse. He'd been to Fort Mercer once, a supply stop masquerading as a military outpost, where backroom deals decided the fate of territories. If the marshal was there, if the land thieves were gathering. Chaska caught his arm. "This is not your fight." John met the warrior's gaze. "It is now. Because some lines couldn't be uncrossed." And John Carter had just crossed his. The ride to Fort Mercer took 3 days through country so rough it scraped the soul raw. John found himself riding point between Chaska and Captain Buchanan, the Apache warriors and Buffalo Soldiers, forming an unlikely column behind them. Nijoni had stayed behind with the children and wounded, but her parting words still burned in John's mind, "Make them see our faces when they die." The young deputy, Tom Wilkins, he'd learned, rode slumped in his saddle, his shoulder wound bound tight, his eyes haunted. He'd sworn to testify against the corrupt marshal, but John wondered if the kid understood they might not live long enough for trials. Fort Mercer loomed at dusk, its wooden walls rising from the canyon floor like rotten teeth. From their vantage on the ridge, John counted 20 horses in the corral, smoke rising from 3 different buildings. Too many men. Buchanan spat into the dust. Marshall's here all right. That's his gray mare by the command post. The captain turned to John, his face grim in the fading light. We got one play. You and me walk in like we're bringing in the Apache for bounty. Get close enough to put lead in the right folks. Chaska objected immediately. You would have us in chains. Only until we're inside, Buchanan countered. But John saw the flaw. Once those gates closed, they'd be outnumbered 10-1. Then Tom Wilkins spoke up, his voice steadier than it had been in days. I'm still a deputy. Let me ride in first. Say I'm bringing prisoners for the marshal's judgment. He met John's eyes. They won't shoot one of their own. The plan took shape in the gathering dark. Wilkins would enter alone, buying time for Buchanan's soldiers to position themselves near the gates. Chaska's warriors would flank the canyon walls, arrows ready. And John? He'd be the bait, the disgraced rancher, captured, trying to help Apaches. It stank of desperation, but it was all they had. As they prepared to move out, Chaska pressed something into John's hand, a small leather pouch holding a single eagle feather. For protection, the warrior murmured. Then, quieter, and for when you must choose. John didn't ask what he meant. Some truths came clear. Only in the doing. Wilkins rode down first, his badge catching the last red rays of sunset. John watched through Buchanan's spyglass as the kid reached the gates, saw him wave his good arm in greeting. The gates creaked open just wide enough to admit him. Minutes stretched like years. Then, a gunshot. Not the sharp crack of a rifle. The dull boom of a shotgun. Buchanan cursed. Move. They hit the fort at a gallop, warriors flowing down the canyon walls like shadows given life. John's heart pounded in his throat as he neared the gates, now hanging ajar. Inside, chaos. Wilkins knelt in the dirt, clutching his bleeding side. A man in a marshal's star stood over him, shotgun smoking. Traitor, the marshal roared. Then he saw the charging riders. His face twisted in recognition, not fear, but fury. Carter. I should have burned your ranch years ago. John's world narrowed to that face, that voice. Because he knew this man. Knew him from nightmares 15 years old. Marshal Cole wasn't just some corrupt official. He was the man who'd ordered the massacre at Little Bend. The man who'd made John Carter an orphan. And now they stood 30 feet apart, with a lifetime of blood between them. The shotgun blast still echoed in John's ears as Marshal Cole's men scrambled for cover. But it wasn't fear John felt staring at the man who'd murdered his family, it was something colder, clearer. The eagle feather burned in his pocket as Chaska's warriors poured through the gates, their arrows finding targets with deadly precision. Buchanan's buffalo soldiers took up firing positions, their disciplined volleys cutting down Cole's hired guns. Yet the marshal just smiled, dragging Wilkins up as a human shield. Always more rats to squash, he spat, pressing his revolver to the deputy's temple. Then, a war cry split the chaos. Nijoni. She rode through the smoke on a paint horse, her son clutched to her chest with one arm, a cavalry pistol in her other hand. How she'd followed them, why she'd come, John had no time to wonder. Cole's grip on Wilkins faltered for just a second. A second was enough. John's bullet took the marshal in the shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. Wilkins collapsed as warriors surged forward. But Cole wasn't finished. With a roar, he yanked a hidden derringer from his boot, and aimed not at John, but at the child in Nijoni's arms. The twist. Chaska's arrow took Cole through the wrist before he could fire, but the marshal's dying act was to kick over a lantern into a trail of gunpowder leading to the fort's ammunition store. "If I don't get that land," he gasped, "nobody will." The fuse sparked to life, snaking toward certain annihilation. John didn't hesitate. He sprinted through gunfire, tackling the powder trail just feet from the explosives, and stamped out the flames with his bare hands as bullets kicked up dirt around him. When he looked up, it was to see Cole's lifeless eyes staring at the canyon sky, the land grant clutched in Buchanan's triumphant grip. The captain helped John up, nodding toward Najoni. "She's the one who rallied the Apache elders to ride after us," he said. "Told them you'd save the proof or die trying." As dawn broke over Fort Mercer, the survivors gathered, soldiers, Apaches, and the wounded but alive Deputy Wilkins. The land grant was safe. The truth would be told. And John Carter, the man who'd spent a lifetime hiding from the past, finally met Chaska's eyes without flinching. "What now?" he asked. The warrior pointed to the eagle feather still tucked in John's shirt. "You carried the protection of my people. That makes you one of us." A pause. "If you choose." Moral lesson. The hardest battles aren't fought for land or gold, but for the choice to stand when others kneel. True justice begins when we fight not just for ourselves, but for those who come after.